Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep on something, well, really crucial. It's about how India and China are working together, when it comes to counterterrorism and cybersecurity, but also where they're struggling. You sent over some really fascinating research and academic paper, and it really gets into the nuts and bolts of it all. So what we're going to try to do today is unpack the key takeaways, right? Like, where are these two big players actually finding common ground on security? Where are things kind of getting stuck? And what does the future hold for this whole cooperation thing? We really want to give you a clear picture of this whole dynamic. It's pretty intricate stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think right off the bat, it's so important to acknowledge that this relationship between India and China, it's not simple. It's not black and white, right? I mean, it's this constantly evolving thing. You see collaboration in some areas, really fierce competition in others. And well, history tells us there are these periods of serious tension, even conflict, right? And security concerns, I mean, the absolute need to work together on those issues, that's been a huge factor in how they interact, for sure.
Okay, so let's kind of lay the groundwork here. The research you sent over points out that this security collaboration, it's not exactly a brand new thing. They've done some joint military drills in the past, a bit of work on border control, even some counterterrorism efforts. But the elephant in the room, the big thing that always hangs over everything is this border dispute they have, right? I mean, there have been some pretty tense military standoffs in recent years. That's got to make things tricky.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's always there in the background. You have these instances where they do manage to cooperate on security, but this border dispute, it's this constant source of mistrust, right? But it is worth remembering, I think, that both countries, they actually signed this pretty important agreement back in 2005. It basically laid out like the political roadmap for how they could finally settle this border thing. At least it gave them a framework conceptually for how to keep the peace, how to manage the dispute along that huge shared border.
And beyond that agreement, that sort of high-level thing, they actually have real channels for communication, right? I'm talking about the counterterrorism dialogue and let's see, there's the working mechanism for consultation and coordination on China-India border affairs. It's a mouthful. Maybe we'll just call it the border coordination mechanism for short.
Yeah, it's much easier.
And of course, there's the annual defense dialogue. So it seems like they're at least talking to each other, keeping those lines open.
Well, oh, yeah, they are. And those mechanisms, they're meant to make it easier to communicate, to engage on specific security stuff. But, the big problem is that the broader geopolitical picture, it can really throw a wrench in things. You can't ignore things like, China's growing influence in the region, how India is building up partnerships with the U.S. and other countries, and just the whole power dynamic shifting in the Asia Pacific. No. All of that, it ends up affecting their security cooperation, no doubt.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs, they actually described India-China ties, this was back in 2021, they called it, this cyclical pattern of like coming together, then pulling apart.
Yeah.
And the paper we're looking at, it points to like the Doklam standoff in 2017 and then that clash in the Galwan Valley in 2020. Those were moments where the mistrust between them just shot up, right? It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, constantly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I mean, those incidents, they're reminders of how much tension there is under the surface, but even with those setbacks, they've kept setting up institutions for security cooperation. There's the China-India Maritime Affairs Dialogue, the Border Coordination Mechanism we just talked about, and the Indo-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. What they're supposed to do is, keep those high-level discussions going, share information, even do joint exercises. Think counterterrorism, maritime security, disaster relief, stuff like that.
So they've got the structures, they've got the agreements, but it sounds like the will, or maybe the deep trust, it's not quite there yet to really make these things work the way they could.
Yeah.
The paper talks about some pretty big roadblocks. They don't always agree on what the real threats are. There's that lack of trust we keep talking about. And then, of course, there's all those geopolitical tensions that just keep getting in the way. And India's skepticism, it seems like a lot of that is because of what China's doing in the South China Sea, how they're building up their military and their alliances with some of India's neighbors. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's a tangled web for sure. All these factors, they make it really hard to have smooth security cooperation. But, when you look at the threats that both countries are facing, things like terrorism and cyber attacks, it becomes pretty clear that they need to work together, at least to some extent. And that brings us to the core of what we're talking about today, counterterrorism and cybersecurity.
Right. So let's start with counterterrorism. On the surface, it seems like their interests totally align, right? I mean, both India and China, they want to get rid of terrorist organizations, groups that could destabilize, well, the whole region, even the whole world, really. At least about the 2008 Mumbai bombings in India, or that attack at the Kunming train station in China in 2014. Neither country is immune to this. It seems like that shared threat would push them to work together more closely, right?
Yeah, you would think so. And to some extent, they have. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, that's a big one. They're both members. It's this formal structure where they can share intelligence and, in theory, launch joint operations against terrorist groups. And within the SCO, there's this thing called the Regional Anti-Terrorist Structure, or RATS. That's the main mechanism for this kind of cooperation. But here's the thing, and this is a key insight, right? While both countries face the threat of terrorism, their focus is totally different. India is worried about groups operating out of Pakistan, and China is much more concerned with what they see as separatist movements within their own borders. And that really limits how much intelligence they're willing to share or how much they can actually work together operationally within the SCO. So RTS, yeah, it has potential, but the impact for just India and China, it's limited.
And they've also got those bilateral agreements, right? The ones just between the two of them. The paper mentions an MEU from 2002 on counterterrorism, and then another agreement in 2014 when Xi Jinping visited India. Those were supposed to ramp up their security cooperation.
Yeah.
So what were they actually trying to do with those agreements? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, they basically laid out this framework for how they could work together, practically. The idea was to make it easier to exchange information and intelligence about terrorism, to cooperate on investigations of terrorist attacks, and maybe even, come up with joint responses to specific threats. These were pretty important steps in terms of formally saying, hey, we're going to work on this together.
And then there are those hand-in-hand joint military exercises. They've been doing those since 2007. I mean, the name itself kind of says it all, right? Cooperation. So what was the main focus of these exercises? What were they trying to get out of them?
Well, counterterrorism was the big thing. It was all about, giving their militaries a chance to train together, to learn from each other, to share their best tactics for counterterrorism operations. And ultimately, it was about, making both of them better equipped to deal with terrorist threats.
But even with all these mechanisms, all these exercises, it seems like they keep running into the same roadblocks, right? Like how they see threats differently, that trust issue that never seems to go away, and of course all the geopolitical stuff going on, and India being worried about China supporting groups based in Pakistan. That just seems like a really sensitive point.
It is a major sticking point. India sees some of those groups in Pakistan as direct threats to their security, right? And they've always, been really concerned about any support, real or perceived, that those groups might be getting from China. And this is where that difference in how they see the threat is so important. China, they often prioritize dealing with what they consider separatist movements inside their own borders. So it makes it tough for them to agree on a united front against terrorism,
It's interesting to look back at how this cooperation has evolved. Historically, the paper actually takes us way back to 1996. They had that agreement on mutual notification of nuclear and missile tests, and it's kind of striking that even in an agreement about nuclear stuff, they included clauses about stopping terrorists from getting those weapons.
Yeah.
It's like they recognized that danger early on. Even back then.
Right.
Yeah. It shows that they understood, at least to some degree, that they needed to keep those dangerous technologies out of the wrong hands. But, that 2002 MOU on counterterrorism, that was a much bigger step. That's where they really started to lay out a more concrete plan for sharing information and coordinating their responses to terrorism.
And then China joining the SCO in 2001, that was a pretty big deal for multilateral cooperation, wasn't it? I mean, that eventually led to RITs being formed in 2006, and that became, this key platform for India and China and the other members to work together on counterterrorism.
It was huge. The SCO and RITs, they created this framework that went beyond just those one-on-one engagements. It meant they could cooperate on security across the whole region, share intelligence, do joint exercises, all that, with multiple countries involved.
And recently, it seems like there's been maybe a bit of an uptick in this cooperation. more joint drills like that Peace Mission 2018 exercise under the SEO, more visits between security officials from both countries. At least from the outside, it looks like things are moving in the right direction, maybe.
Yeah, it does seem like they're more willing to engage with each other, to work together. But, we have to remember all those hurdles we've talked about, how they assess threats differently, the trust issues, the geopolitics, all that stuff. It's still limiting how effective their cooperation can be, how deep it can go. And India's concerns about those Pakistan-based groups, that's a perfect example of those challenges.
Okay, so where does all this leave us? What's the current state of counterterrorism cooperation between India and China? It sounds like they've got all these things going on both bilaterally and multilaterally.
That's right. On the bilateral front, they set up that high-level mechanism on counterterrorism and security back in 2017. That was meant to be a big step forward. The idea was to work together more on training, on sharing intelligence more consistently, and just collaborating more closely on security.
And then there was that SCO joint exercise in 2018, Peace Mission 2018, which was held in Russia. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just an India-China thing. All the SCO members were there. It shows that they're cooperating on this, on a regional level within that SCO framework.
Exactly. It shows they're committed to working together on terrorism within the SCO. And there is also that 2018 MOU, the one about drug control and reducing drug demand. Now, that might not be directly about counterterrorism, but it is another example of them trying to tackle things like drug trafficking, which can often be linked to how terrorist groups get funding.
But then the paper brings up those same fundamental problems, right? They just see threats so differently. India is focused on Pakistan-based groups, and China's worried about separatism in Xinjiang. And then there's that lack of trust between them. It's like they want to cooperate, but these big issues just keep getting in the way.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The willingness is there, and they've got all these mechanisms, but it's just not as effective as it could be because they disagree on such fundamental things, and they don't fully trust each other.
Okay, so what about the future? Are there ways they could cooperate more deeply on counterterrorism? Where could we see more collaboration, and what would they both get out of it?
Well, there are definitely some promising areas. I think better intelligence sharing is really key. If they can share information that's accurate and timely, they'll be much better equipped to prevent and respond to threats. And, more joint training, capacity building for law enforcement, that could make a big difference too. Working together more closely in those multilateral forums like the SKO and BRICS, that could really boost their impact. And then there's the whole issue of cross-border terrorism. That's a tough one, but if they can come up with joint strategies to tackle it, that would be huge. And, with the rise of cyber threats, working together to fight cyber terrorism, that's becoming more and more important. And then finally, there's disrupting the financing of terrorism. If they can share information about money laundering and other illegal financial activities, that could really help cut off the flow of money to these groups.
But none of that's going to happen unless they deal with those core issues, right? Like building trust. That's the key.
It all comes back to trust, yeah. For deeper collaboration to work, both sides need to be willing to talk about their differences, really try to understand each other's security concerns. And they need to be more transparent about what they're doing to prove that they're serious about working together.
So let's unpack those challenges a bit more. We've touched on some, but the paper really dives into a few key ones. First, there's the way they perceive threats. India's focused on Pakistan, China's on Xinjiang. How do you even begin to bridge that kind of fundamental difference in perspective?
It's tough, but it starts with understanding, with being willing to acknowledge that the other side has real security concerns, even if you don't always agree with them. It means having open conversations, maybe even doing joint threat assessments so they can really grasp the nuances of what each country is facing. It's about, going beyond just thinking about your own national interests and realizing that security in the region, it's all interconnected.
And then there's that lack of trust. That historical skepticism, the feeling that the other side isn't being completely transparent. That's hard to overcome.
It is. Building trust takes time. It takes consistent effort. It means engaging with each other regularly at all levels and being more transparent about your actions and your intentions. And it means showing that you're committed to cooperation, even when things are, rocky in other areas of the relationship. Communication, honest communication, that's really key.
And we can't forget about all this geopolitical tensions. It feels like every time they try to cooperate on security, it's happening against this backdrop of strategic rivalry.
Yeah, that's the reality. Security cooperation, it doesn't happen in a bubble. It's always going to be affected by the overall relationship and what's happening geopolitically. What they need to do is find specific areas where they can work together, areas that benefit both of them, even if they're competing in other areas.
And then you've got the border disputes. Those are a huge problem. They strain the whole relationship, and then you've got accusations flying back and forth about supporting regional groups. It's just a really tough environment to try to build security cooperation in.
It is. If they could, finally resolve that border issue, or at least find a way to manage it effectively to stop things from escalating, that would make a huge difference. It would improve the whole atmosphere for cooperation, not just on counterterrorism, but on everything. And those accusations about supporting regional groups, that just makes things worse. It just deepens the mistrust and undermines any progress they're trying to make.
The paper also mentions domestic politics. How can, internal politics in both countries affect their ability to work together on something like counterterrorism?
Oh, it can have a huge impact. A government's approach to foreign policy, security, all that, it's shaped by what's happening domestically. Public opinion, political sensitivities, the need to look strong, all that can make it hard to really cooperate, especially on issues like terrorism, which can be, really sensitive. You often have strong nationalist feelings, and people within a country might disagree on who the real threats are. So it's definitely a factor.
So it sounds like the big takeaway here is that if they really want counterterrorism cooperation to work, they need to talk to each other, they need to build trust, they need to agree on what the threat is, and maybe hardest of all, they need to put aside some of those big geopolitical differences, for the good of the region, for the good of the world.
You got it.
Yeah.
The challenges they're real and they go deep, but the potential benefits of working together effectively, those are huge too.
Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about cybersecurity. That's another really critical area where, at least officially, India and China have started to work together. And given how connected everything is these days and how cyber threats are just growing and growing, it feels like this is an area where cooperation isn't just, a nice to have, it's essential.
I completely agree. Cybersecurity, it's become this crucial part of national security, of regional security. Both India and China, they understand that, cyber attacks can cripple infrastructure, mess up economies, weaken national security. So that shared vulnerability, that's why they need to work together, at least to some degree.
But, the paper you sent, it points out that historically they haven't really cooperated much in this area. Instead, there have been a lot of accusations, about cyber espionage and hacking, that kind of thing. That doesn't exactly create a warm and fuzzy environment for collaboration, right?
Yeah. No, it doesn't. All that suspicion, all those accusations, it's created a real lack of trust. Overcoming that, letting go of that baggage, that's a big challenge if they want to build something that actually works.
But they have been making some efforts, right? Like they've set up a cybersecurity dialogue, and then there's that agreement they signed back in 2015, that cybersecurity cooperation agreement. What was in that agreement exactly?
That 2015 agreement was a good step. It was about cooperating in some key areas. Like they agreed to set up secure communication channels so they could actually talk to each other safely. They agreed to share information about cyber attacks and, new threats. And they wanted to share their best practices, how they handle cybersecurity. And a big part of that agreement was setting up a hotline between their computer emergency response teams, the CERTs. That way they could communicate quickly and share info if there was like a cyber incident.
That hotline, that sounds like a really practical step towards sharing info in real time. The paper also talks about, some big obstacles, things that are getting in the way of them really collaborating on cybersecurity. That lack of trust we keep talking about. And then there are these fundamental differences in how they approach cybersecurity in the first place. You unpack that a bit. Like India really seems to value privacy and free expression, while China prioritizes state security and, controlling the internet.
Exactly. So India's approach, it's all about individual privacy and the idea that people should be able to express themselves freely online, right? But China, they're much more focused on state security and in the government having control over what happens on the internet. To give you a concrete example, think about how India's new data protection laws, they really emphasize things like data localization and individual rights. But a Chinese regulation, that might require companies to share data with the government for national security reasons. It's a totally different philosophy about how data should be governed, how the internet should be regulated, and how to balance individual rights with what the state wants. And that makes it hard to find common ground, to come up with a system for cooperating on cybersecurity that works for both of them.
So where do things stand right now with their cybersecurity cooperation? It sounds like they've done some stuff, but not a lot.
Yeah, that's about right. They've got the MOU, they set up that joint working group, but overall it's pretty modest. The 2015 MOU, they actually reaffirmed that in 2018, and that's still their main framework. It's focused on sharing information about threats and capacity building. And that high-level working group on cybersecurity, they've met a couple of times, talked about data protection, cybercrime, all that. And they're both involved in those international cybersecurity initiatives, like the ESCO, BRICS, and the UN's group of experts on cybersecurity. So they're engaged, but not as deeply as they could be.
But it's those same old roadblocks, isn't it? They have different policies, they don't trust each other, and then there's all the geopolitical tension. It really highlights how important it is for them to build trust and create a more, solid system for working together.
You got it. Without trust, without a shared understanding of, what cybersecurity should look like, deeper cooperation is going to be really tough.
Okay, so looking ahead, what are the areas where they could cooperate more deeply on cybersecurity? Where could they both benefit from working together more closely? Like, could we see them developing technologies together?
There's a lot of potential, yeah. Imagine them doing joint research and development on cutting-edge cybersecurity tech, Things like AI, blockchain, quantum computing. That could benefit both of them, maybe even create new markets for their tech industries. And, sharing information more, setting up systems to respond to incidents together, that would make them much better at dealing with cyber threats. And then there's the whole issue of not having enough cybersecurity professionals. If they work together on training and capacity building, that could help both of them address that shortage. And then there's the global level, If they could collaborate on setting international norms and standards for cyberspace, that would create more stability for everyone. And of course, a more secure cyber environment, that's good for business, right? It would benefit tech companies in both countries.
But just like with counterterrorism, there are some serious challenges, some major hurdles they have to overcome. And the paper really digs into those. One of the biggest seems to be that fundamental difference in how they govern data and regulate the internet. That's a pretty tough gap to bridge, right?
It is. How they approach data protection, internet regulation, it all reflects very different values, different priorities. Finding a way to cooperate on cybersecurity while respecting those differences, that's going to take some careful negotiation. They need to focus on the areas where they have shared interests, where those differences aren't such a big deal.
And then there's that trust deficit again, right?
Yeah.
All those historical tensions, the border conflicts, it all casts a shadow over everything.
Yeah. That lack of trust creates this atmosphere of suspicion, It makes it hard to share sensitive information, to really work together on something as delicate as cybersecurity.
And those geopolitical tensions, they spill over into the cyber domain too, right? It's like cyberspace becomes another battleground for their rivalry.
That's exactly what happens. Geopolitical tensions, they lead to mistrust, even conflict online. Both sides might see what the other is doing in cyberspace as, some kind of strategic threat.
And then there are the accusations about stealing intellectual property, about cyber espionage. I mean, that just destroys any foundation for trust, doesn't it?
It's hugely damaging, yeah. Those kinds of accusations just reinforce all the negative perceptions they have of each other. It makes it almost impossible to build the kind of trust you need for real collaboration.
So even though they've, signed agreements, had dialogues, it sounds like they're still not really coordinating that well. Their approaches to cybersecurity are still pretty different.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. They have these agreements, but in practice, they're not really working together that much. And their systems for governing cybersecurity, those are still quite different.
It sounds like to really tackle these problems, they're going to need to put in a lot of effort, diplomatically, and they need to make a real effort to build trust. And they need to find ways to create systems for governing cybersecurity that take their different perspectives into account.
Exactly. It's not a quick fix. It's a long process, and they both need to be committed to it. They need to be willing to work through those differences.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a minute and compare things. How does India-China cooperation in counterterrorism and cybersecurity compare to India's relationships with other countries in these areas, like with the U.S., Israel, or Russia on counterterrorism, or the U.S., Japan, or the EU on cybersecurity?
Well, when you compare it to those other relationships, especially on security, it's clear that India and China are, still in the early stages. The way India works with the US, Israel, Russia on counterterrorism, that's much more developed. They share a lot more intelligence, they do a lot more joint training, and they actually coordinate their operations much more closely. And it's the same with cybersecurity. India's partnerships with the US, Japan, the EU, they're more advanced. They share more information, they do joint research and development, and they have a much more similar approach to, standards and governance. And that's not really surprising, right? I mean, those relationships, they have a different history, different levels of trust, different strategic alignments compared to the whole India-China situation, which is just much more complex. But it does show you that there's a lot of potential for India and China to grow their cooperation, especially in the areas like intelligence sharing, capacity building, and actually doing joint operations. But they need to address those underlying challenges first.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are there any specific lessons that India and China could learn from, those other partnerships, from what works well in those relationships? Things they could apply to their own cooperation on counterterrorism and cybersecurity?
Oh, absolutely. There are a few key takeaways. First, the political leadership, they have to be committed. They have to be the ones driving the cooperation and making sure it keeps going, even when there are obstacles. The U.S.-India Joint Working Group on Counterterrorism, that's a great example. That's been going on for a long time because the leaders are committed to it. Second, they have to build trust. That means talking to each other regularly, being honest, sharing information, and actually doing things together. Like the U.S. and India, they have those Yuddhabhyas military exercises. That's the kind of thing that builds trust. Third, capacity building is key. Joint training, providing technical assistance, that can make a huge difference. Like the U.S. helps train Indian law enforcement agencies. That kind of support is invaluable. Fourth, they need to work on standardizing their procedures and technologies, making them compatible so they can work together seamlessly. Like back in 2004 during the tsunami, the US and Indian navies, they were able to coordinate so well because they were interoperable. And finally, they should invest in joint research and development. That can drive innovation and help them tackle new challenges together. The US-India Science and Technology Endowment Fund, that's a good model. All of these are lessons that India and China could learn from.
Okay, so let's wrap things up. What are the key findings here? It sounds like India and China, they're trying to work together on counterterrorism and cybersecurity, but they don't really trust each other. And then there are all those geopolitical tensions. And it seems like the cybersecurity stuff is even further behind.
That's a good summary, yeah. They've got the mechanisms, they've got the agreements, but they're just not that effective. But as we've been saying, there's definitely potential there, especially if they can share more intelligence and do more joint R&D. That could really benefit both of them, but only if they deal with those underlying issues.
And it's clear they could, learn a lot from how other countries are cooperating.
Definitely. Looking at those models can give them ideas about how to make their own cooperation stronger. I think the main things for them to focus on going forward are building trust, communicating more, sharing more information, and figuring out how to bridge those gaps in how they see threats and how they approach things like data governance.
So, to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. Getting India and China to cooperate more deeply on security, it's not easy. But if they can do it, the impact on the region, on the whole world, it'd be huge. So think about it. What would a real breakthrough look like? What would it take for them to really trust each other, to really collaborate? And what would the world gain if they did? That's something we're thinking about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, everyone.
We hope this has given you a better understanding of how India and China are working together on security, where the problems are, and what the future might hold.
Yeah, and we'd love for you to, keep thinking about this. What do you think will happen with this cooperation in the future? What will make it easier? What will make it harder? Maybe even explore the role of those big multilateral organizations or how those border disputes are still affecting everything. Keep asking those questions. Keep exploring. Until next time.